Elias Thorne stood before the rusted iron gates of Ironwood Heights, the morning fog clinging to the jagged concrete like a shroud. They called this place the Graveyard, a name earned not just from decaying architecture, but from the buried dreams of every soul inside. For Elias, a combat veteran, the decay felt familiar. The school looked like a fortress under siege. Armed security guards paced the perimeter, their cold eyes replacing the welcoming faces of faculty. The flickering lights hummed with a low frequency that vibrated in Elias's teeth. He adjusted his collar, feeling the weight of the past. He was here because of a ghost, a student in his previous district he had failed to save. This job was his final act of penance, a desperate attempt to prove that a single life could still be salvaged from the wreckage of a broken system. The air inside was thick with floor wax and stale smoke. He found the principal's office at the end of a dim corridor. Miller didn't look up from his paperwork as Elias entered. The administrator's face was a mask of weary resignation, lined by years of looking the other way. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he offered a warning. He explained that Ironwood Heights didn't operate on grades or standard curriculum. It operated on a delicate, unspoken treaty. The faculty didn't teach. They maintained the peace by letting the gangs govern themselves. He knew the game Miller was playing, one of survival, where the silence of the hallways was bought with the currency of fear. Miller leaned back, telling Elias that survival meant staying invisible. "Don't be a hero, Mr. Thorne," Miller muttered. "We let the Hollows run the social structure, and in exchange, they keep the violence contained. It's a balance. Don't tip the scale." Stepping back into the hallway, Elias felt the eyes of the students tracking his every move. Among them was Jax, the undisputed leader of the Hollows gang. Jax carried himself with the calculated stillness of a predatory animal. He sat on a radiator, surrounded by a group of loyalists, his expensive sneakers contrasting sharply with the peeling paint of the walls. The air seemed to chill in his presence, the very atmosphere bending to his silent authority. He didn't speak, but his presence commanded the space, a silent king of a hollow empire. Jax watched Elias with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, a look that said he had seen dozens of teachers come and go, and none had ever left a mark. Elias's first period was a test of iron. In the middle of the room sat Leo, a small, bespectacled boy hunched over a notebook trying to make himself small. Two of Jax's associates began circling him, mocking his focus, their hands reaching for his bag. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The room went silent as Elias stepped forward. He didn't shout. He simply stood between Leo and the bullies, his stature reflecting his military past. "Sit down," Elias commanded. The bullies hesitated, stunned by the sheer lack of fear in the new teacher's eyes. It was the first time in years someone had dared to intervene. Word traveled fast. By the end of the hour, Jax was waiting for Elias in the hallway. The gang leader leaned in close, his voice a low hiss. "You're a guest here, Thorne," Jax said. "And guests who overstay their welcome end up in the ground. Leo belongs to us. Don't touch what isn't yours." Elias didn't blink, meeting the boy's gaze with a stoic intensity that seemed to catch Jax off guard. He walked past the gang leader without a word, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. That evening, the weight of the encounter followed him home to his modest apartment. He tried to focus on his lesson plans, but the silence of the room felt heavy and expectant. When he finally walked into his bedroom to find rest, his heart skipped a beat. Sitting dead center on his white pillow was a single piece of chalk. It had been snapped in half and soaked in fresh, dark blood. The message was unmistakable. He was being watched, he was being marked, and the war for Ironwood Heights had only just begun. Elias Thorne didn't clean the blood from the chalk immediately. Instead, he stared at it for a long time, the stain reminding him of the combat zones he had left behind. To him, it was a familiar signal of engagement. The next afternoon, instead of fleeing when the final bell rang, Elias found his way to the back of the library, past the shelves of dust-covered encyclopedias. There, hidden behind a stack of broken chairs, he found Leo. The boy was scribbling frantically in a tattered notebook. It was advanced calculus, solved with staggering precision. Elias sat across from him, and for the first time, the boy didn't flinch. For the next 2 weeks, these secret tutoring sessions became their sanctuary. Elias discovered that Leo saw numbers as a language of order in a world of chaos. Education wasn't just a subject, it was a ladder he was building to climb out of the abyss of Ironwood Heights. However, the Hollows were not blind. Jax began a campaign of psychological attrition designed to break Elias's spirit. On Monday, Elias found all 4 tires of his car shredded. On Tuesday, the word traitor was scorched into his classroom door in jagged black letters. The other students now avoided his gaze entirely, forbidden by Jax from acknowledging the man who had dared to disrupt the school's social order. This isolation was a vacuum designed to suck the air out of Elias's resolve. Yet during their quiet hours in the library, Elias shared his own scars. He told Leo about the dusty streets of overseas deployments, about the comrades he had lost not to bullets, but to the slow loss of hope. He explained that true strength wasn't the ability to command fear, but the courage to build something that could outlast the architect. For Leo, a child raised on the currency of fear, this was a revelation more profound than any equation. The deeper Elias dug, the more he realized the infection reached the very top. One evening, while searching for misplaced records, he overheard a hushed conversation in Principal Miller's suite. Through the crack in the door, he saw Jax's older brother sliding an envelope thick with cash across the desk. Miller's peace was a paid-for silence. The school was a staging ground for a narcotics ring, and the principal was the gatekeeper. The weight of this realization was a physical blow. Elias wasn't just fighting a teenage gang, he was fighting a corrupt system that had sold its children's futures for a profit margin. He knew then that the Hollows wouldn't stop at simple intimidation. They couldn't afford to let him stay. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Thursday. A tray was thrown, a shout echoed, and the cafeteria erupted into a choreographed riot. While security guards rushed to contain the chaos, Elias spotted Jax and his inner circle slipping through a side door, dragging a resisting Leo toward the basement. The emergency protocol blared over the intercom, commanding all teachers to lock their doors and remain inside. Elias stood at his door, his hand on the key. He could stay safe, or he could descend into the darkness to face his past. He chose the latter, moving with the silent, purposeful gait of a soldier returning to the front lines. The air in the boiler room was thick with rust and damp concrete. Steam hissed from pipes, creating a labyrinth of shadows. At the center of the room, under a flickering bulb, stood Jax, surrounded by the Hollows. Leo was on his knees, his face a map of terror. Jax looked up as Elias entered, a cold smile spreading across his face. He didn't look surprised. He looked triumphant. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a heavy black handgun, the metal glinting under the bulb. But he didn't aim it at Elias. Instead, he gripped the barrel and offered the handle to Leo. The boy's hands shook as he looked from the weapon to the man who had given him hope. "Prove you're one of us, Leo," Jax whispered, his voice echoing in the metallic chamber. "Kill the teacher who corrupted your mind. Show him what happens to people who try to change the graveyard." The heavy iron door of the boiler room groaned as it settled, sealing Elias inside with the ghosts of his past. The steam from the pipes hissed, but Elias's heartbeat remained a steady, rhythmic drum. He didn't look at the gun in Leo's trembling hands. Instead, he locked eyes with Jax. He saw the boy behind the mask, not the king of the Hollows, but a child who had been discarded by every system meant to protect him. Elias spoke with a quiet, powerful empathy. He told Jax that he knew about the foster homes and the rejection. He told him that being feared wasn't the same as being seen. He saw Jax flinch, the first crack in a facade built over years of pain. Elias then looked at Leo and told him that the math of his life didn't have to end in a zero. He had a choice. Leo's fingers brushed the trigger, the metal clicking in the absolute silence of the basement. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a heavy, shuddering gasp, Leo let the weapon fall. It hit the concrete with a thud that echoed. Jax roared in bitter frustration, But as he moved to reclaim the weapon, something shifted. From the shadows of the rusted machinery, students emerged. They were the ones who had been forced to watch and suffer in silence. One by one, they stepped into the light, placing themselves between Elias and Jax. They weren't fighting with fists, they were fighting with their presence. The fear economy that had kept Ironwood Heights in a stranglehold for decades had collapsed. Jax was no longer a leader. He was just a lonely boy standing in the dark. The aftermath was a blur of blue and red lights. Elias had reached out to his old military network, bringing in federal investigators who didn't care about Ironwood's bribes. He watched as Principal Miller was led out in handcuffs, his suit looking ridiculous against the decaying school. The graveyard was finally being excavated. The drug ring was dismantled within days. The evidence was overwhelming, exposing the neglect that had poisoned the district. The paper trail found there was the final nail in the coffin of the school's corrupt era. Redemption is a slow process, but for Elias, it began with the sound of a hammer. Over the next few months, the community began to reclaim the school. Broken windows were replaced with glass that let the golden sunlight back in. The graffiti was scrubbed away, replaced by vivid murals of hope. Most importantly, the private security guards were replaced by counselors who knew the students' names. Elias stayed. He didn't leave when the headlines faded. He stayed for the early morning tutoring and the exhausting late-night grading. The transformation culminated on a bright June morning. The gymnasium was filled with the scent of lilies and the hum of proud families. Leo stood on the stage, wearing a graduation gown that seemed to glow in the flickering light. He wasn't the shaking boy from the boiler room. He was the valedictorian of Ironwood Heights. As he accepted his diploma, he looked toward the back of the room and caught Elias's eye. A nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the life that had been saved. Elias felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the reality of a future preserved. As the ceremony ended, Elias walked toward the front gates. A new group of incoming freshmen were gathering for a tour, their eyes wide with uncertainty. He adjusted his collar and took a deep breath. The war for their futures was far from over, and the shadows would always try to return. But as he looked at Leo throwing his cap into the air, Elias knew he wasn't fighting alone anymore. He had taught them how to survive the darkness, and now it was time to teach them how to shine. Elias watched the horizon with a steady, hopeful gaze.